Today, thought I'd introduce you to a new synthesizer that I've just bought. It's a Behringer Pro-1, which is a clone of a Sequential Circuits Pro-1 synthesizer. Now, I built a synthesizer when I was about 18 years old, and haven't really used one properly since then. So I was really getting back into it, and got the Pro-1, and the Behringer documentation basically tells you what all the knobs do, but expects you to know how to use it first of all. So the original Sequential Circuits manual was much better, and it is available on the web, but it's a PDF of a photocopy, and it's a bit grim. And there's a couple of other little features on the new Behringer version that aren't included in that manual. So I thought it was good to cover it. And in the process, what I've done is actually written a new manual, which I've published for download on the Cool Cat Ukes website, and redrawn the diagrams and things. So this is a much friendlier manual, neater to print. Prints nicely as an A5 booklet. And it's about 34 pages. But what I thought I'd do in the video today is give you a quick intro how to use one. For a beginner, effectively like me, even getting a squeak out of it to start with is a bit of a challenge. So there are various sections to the synthesizer, and it's slightly confused by one of the sections being on the left, which really ought to be somewhere in the middle. And in the manual it's described in the middle. But you start with the oscillators. There are two oscillators. That's what actually generates the waves that you can hear. And they're oscillator A, oscillator B. There's also a low frequency oscillator. We'll come back to that later. But the two oscillators are what are driven from your keyboard. Now this is connected via MIDI. It's MIDI over USB. And I've got it working through Logic Pro, my audio software. There's other ways you can connect. You can connect 5-pin MIDI in. So if you've got a keyboard that's got a 5-pin MIDI, you can just connect it directly to the Pro-1 without a computer at all. So the keyboard is separate. I'm using my Casio piano. Just turn the piano sound. So it's got a piano sound. If I just switch the Pro-1 off for a second so it doesn't make any noises, you can hear my piano sounds from the Pro-1. And there's the first difference. On the normal keyboard you'll often play multiple keys at the same time. That's polyphonic. The Pro-1 is monophonic, so it'll only work with one key at a time. Makes it great for bass lines, but if you're a seasoned keyboard player, then you might find it a little bit restrictive. It does have one little poly mode, which is quite neat. I'll show you that. Anyway, first thing, I'll use one of the oscillators. I use oscillator A, so I'll turn that up in the mixer. So the mixer allows oscillator A, which is driven from the keyboard, to the mixer sets the volume of each part. So we've got oscillator A, oscillator B, and also noise. And the noise I can output as well. That then goes through to the filter and amplifier sections, and then out via the master volume on the right here. So I've set this up with the oscillator. I've got a wave selected here. I've got a sawtooth wave, and set the amplitude up on oscillator A. So if I press a key on the keyboard, I get a tone out. So there's a C, and going down the octaves. So you'll notice if I press a second key, nothing happens. One of the cool things you've got, if I then take my finger off, it will basically play the lowest key. There's also a glide function. Which allows you to glide, and I can control the speed of that to very slow. just going between the keys. So a simple glide function just makes it a bit softer between the notes. I'll leave that on 1 just so it's a bit, just in case I do anything with that. So you've got different shapes. I can switch in a square wave. Sounds very similar, but I can change the pulse width of that. You will notice slight difference in sound. I can actually join the two together. Again, not much difference there. And we've got octave selection and so on. If I switch the tuner on, we can see if I change the frequency, I can tune that key in as close as I can to give me my C as I go up the keyboard. So we can then introduce Oscillator B. So it's a second oscillator that runs at exactly the same time, and I've set this to activate from the keyboard, and I'll switch in a tone, and now you can kind of hear two tones together because I've got them set at different octaves. So I'm getting a dual tone there. I can actually tune one off a bit to give a bit more character to the tone if I like. And because they're different octaves, kind of gives that sawtooth a different character. Put them on the same octave, you kind of get that resonating, pulsing sound. Quite nice. So I can put in different amounts of the mix. So turn B up, I could turn A down, and B up, and so on. So working with that for a second, if I look at the envelope section, this is gated. You'll see the gate LED coming on when I press a key, and that gates this amplifier. So attack means how quickly it starts playing the key. So when I press the key, it just takes a little time. If I exaggerate that, it takes a little time to come in, and then decay is how much it will go down to the level I set sustain. So sustain is after the attack and decay, and then it goes down to a certain level, so I can set that really low. And decay is how long it takes to go down to that low level. So I'll put sustain up high, and then release is kind of when you release the key, how long it takes to fade away. So I've got a little bit of sustain on there if you like. There's some other knobs in the filter, resonance, which is kind of a feedback, which isn't doing much at the moment. Now the clever thing with the really clever thing with the Pro 1 is this modulation section here. This really ought to be placed around here, I think. But this allows me to use other inputs and feedbacks from the other oscillators and the LFO. So if I use the LFO, which is a low frequency oscillator, I can add this in and kind of modulate oscillator A if I like. So I can send the output of this section, the from section, use the LFO, and you can hear a modulation going on, which is controlled by this LFO. And again, I've got a shape form here, so I can choose the shape and the frequency that it's modulating. Let's turn Oscillator B down and Oscillator A up. Much more apparent now. Right up to a really quite harsh sound. Still got that decay going on, the sustain going on there. So you start to combine these other things. If I use a square wave, for example, just use the square wave on Oscillator A, I can actually use the LFO to control the pulse width. take the frequency off, and it's modifying that pulse width of the square wave, which you can see on the output waveform. And then it all starts to come together. So I can add different things. I can add, for example, I could use that LFO to modulate the frequency of oscillator A and the pulse width of oscillator B. So I've now got a sawtooth on oscillator A, which is changing its frequency, and the pulse width is being changed on oscillator B. And here I can control the amount of that effect that goes on. So I can have quite a subtle effect. If I turn the octaves down, so we can get some quite neat effects. Just switch those off for a second and I'll show you the other thing that is quite good. We've got this poly mode available to us, which I'll switch these both to sawtooth again. So it's still got both oscillators running as standard. With poly mode, if you press a second key, it will change the frequency of oscillator B. So effectively, the first key is driving oscillator A, the second key oscillator B. So that's pretty much the whole thing. By playing with those effects, you can get a lot more out of this synth. So there you go. There's the Pro 1. Very quick intro. We've scratched the surface. Hardly got any sophisticated sounds out of it. It's just a start, but the big thing is getting a sound out of it to start with. But the big thing I wanted to talk about was really the manual. So the user guide, this will help you get started. It's much more straightforward looking at this than the one that's supplied with the unit. So free to download from coolcatukes.com, and if you get a Pro 1, enjoy. Cheers.